Visual delight, an eloquent statement on visual delight of craft-based art tradition versus the collapsing weight of the strategy of global entrepreneurship. And letting us appreciate your artistic production without talking. I'm tempted to make a quote of Wittgenstein. I'm sure you will predict which. Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist, wovon man nicht sprechen kann. Darüber muss man schweigen.
Nein, darüber muss man zeichnen.
Okay. The world is everything that is the case. What cannot be spoken must be passed on in silence. And what Nina says, it must be passed on in sign. So there is a debate here with Wittgenstein, apparently. I don't think Wittgenstein is so hostile to non-linguistic expressions as people would have it to. He's more sophisticated than that. But at any rate, we are now going to have a panel with Päivikki and Sofia and Nina. We'll just rearrange the stage a little bit, and we'll keep it to half an hour plus. So I'll first introduce the topic which I saw floating up from our interactions yesterday evening. I'll give it a pitch, and then you'll give your own bids to that topic. Maybe reply to each other's pitch, and then we'll have a discussion with the audience. Just give us some time to just rearrange quickly. Comfortable?
Huh?
I gave you some props. You may choose to use them or not. We need the boards on stage afterwards when we finish for the next session, so please take your notes, but leave the boards.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to, in a way, from what we talked about yesterday, socializing, I realized that a topic that could bind this group together is the notion that the history of printmaking might be ripe to be rewritten somehow. And that you have, in a way, agendas for that, each one of you, that are different. It started with Päivikki, then to Sophie, and then with Nina, and the topic kind of burgeoned and matured through that. I decided that I would shortly mention a book by Georges Didier Huberman from 2008, which is called the Resemblance by Contact. It's French, La Ressemblance par Contact, Archéologie, Anachronisme et Modernité de l'Empreinte. It means resemblance by contact, archaeology, anachronism, and modernity of print. The reason why I brought that is, first, that Didier Huberman is a kind of student of the arts that resembles Benjamin in the sense that he seeks closeness.
So when was that written?
2008.
Okay.
I'll give you the references if you're interested. First of all, it's a theory book with images, which is not always usual in this kind of white publication from French sources. This is Édition Minuit. But also, he's actually half of the book is about Marcel Duchamp. But then not Marcel Duchamp as a postmodern artist, as is often post-dated, as in hindsight is being interpreted as a kind of postmodern conceptualist. But he's reading him as a modern artist. And this modernism that he's identifying in Duchamp is released by the fact of his being trained as a printer to avoid being drafted as a soldier in the First World War. And that's, after that, he made the famous flip of coin and decided to go to the United States. So his two, actually he wasn't trained an artist, he was trained a printmaker, and he was trained as a librarian. Didier Huberman also makes a point out of how he was really researching both ancient techniques like the projection machines of Albrecht Dürer, also how is his infatuation with Böcklin and with other like Titian, this kind of a really epitome of the Benjaminesque aura in art, and also how he was actually studying painting in its work and not only in its mud and results. And this is where you get the La Mariée, or the big glass. So a study of painting done in glass and transported, as it were, in a different medium. What he does, so he celebrates actually Duchamp's investment in material techniques and his abduction of these techniques for experimental purposes, for a kind of reflection that he identifies as concrete and manual. So he's not so conceptual that he became, perhaps after Joseph Kosuth. This is a matter of discussion, but still I think it's interesting to bring along this book because it's an example of someone wanting to rewrite the history of print. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm a bit curious how, in a way, now I gave let's say, Didi Huberman's pitch for the grounds, needs, and possibility to rewrite the history of printmaking. I'm curious what your bids might be on that particular topic.
From this?
Not from that, but from
because that was interesting.
Yeah, from your, yeah, of course it is. Yeah. That's why I brought it.
Yeah.
I'm just curious from listening to you that there's an assessment of the graphic field in each case. We are at the brink of understanding maybe contemporariness as not a theoretical, let's say, impact on art practice, but that the contemporary dimension is part of artistic practice itself, somehow. And that there are layers of time, as in your presentation. There are layers of different possibilities and techniques ranging from the classical one to the digital ones. And there's the possibility of, let's say, waking up a reflection and a theorizing from practice, as it were, that I interpret might be your point of view. So from your own work, could you elaborate a bit on the possibility and eventually the need to open up, not to conclude the challenge of rewriting history of printmaking?
Well, as Nina, at the end of her talk, told this story about denial of speaking printmaking and techniques, that was an impulse for me to start investigating the printmaking practices and processes, and also through my own artistic practice, I went to history and found something parallels, and they were not the parallels what we were used to. So I tried to find a language with which I could, of course it's not very, how do you say, encouraging, but I didn't accept that I couldn't speak about printmaking. So I tried to find new concepts and go to the history and find something else. And as we see from this Duchamp, there is a lot of things that we should consider.
If we go into details.
If we rewrite it again.
Right. And it's worthwhile going into those details because it brings us way back before Rosalind Krauss, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you have a comment to this?
I think for me it started to think about finding out in history when printmaking was invented and how it was like. I heard all the time these kind of topics, which I told you, like that it was because it's important, his reproducibility and everything, and I was not so convinced about these ideas around it. And then I started also to search into history, and then I found out that there were some mistakes about generally speaking about printmaking, and also, and then I became very interested in finding really like other reasons why to use printmaking in a way, and because I wanted to open up actually the way of practicing printmaking to the artists that came in the Frans Materieel Center. And that's also where I found that book that you brought. And I think it's a very challenging moment to discover new items in printmaking, and I really enjoy it to rethink actually the history of printmaking, because I think it's important that every history is something subjective. So as an artist you can play also with all this kind of input. You can read about stories about printmaking. Yeah, so I think it's important to open up the history in a way, and rewriting.
Because it's interesting that actually Didi Huberman, he goes from antiquity, then to Renaissance, and then the big chunk of Marcel Duchamp. And that's it. And that's, of course, doesn't put less weight on the biblical references to Duchamp, obviously. So he's a towering figure also here. But the framing of his work is completely transformed by the reference to print. In the sense that he's interested in multiplication, variation, he's interested in additions, and picking up happy moments of happy accidents, utilizing it in the work. In works that ranged from, let's say, taking 16 to 20 years to make, to the momentary selection of ready-mades, and in between all the experimentalism that ended up in boxes. So, I mean, if we really take this seriously in terms of creating a readability of such varied artistic practices, I think we are very close to what Päivikki is talking about, and actually also finding a limited tool set to generate this type of wealth of possible expressions without arresting further developments, which obviously is quite important. And then I'm curious also about when it comes to Päivikki and Nina, I'm curious about what, as a strategy, I mean, let's say that we have a choice between confrontational strategies that kind of oppose analog and digital. You don't do that. Or it's more mitigated.
It's a one level in a way. Of course we can make it, but also there is some continuity, I think.
A continuity.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, okay. Whereas your strategy is to, at least for pedagogical purposes, to oppose, let's say, on the one hand, the art background, which is yours, from which you grew, the regime of conceptualizing discourse that was, in a way, had a predatorial type of logic, and within this tension, as it were, to develop something, which is where you stand now, and a certain number of dilemmas that you're still facing, because having developed this discursive capability does not make you a better artist, as you say.
No.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yes.
So I feel that there's a kind of cogency in the views that you have expressed through your talks in this group, and that might be a fertile ground for the audience too to ask him questions. I'm sure that there's more than one. Let's say I think that Nina, your talk eventually really hit some emotional strings in a large part of this audience, because it's a deeply felt issue. And then at the same time, how can we take a step from that and go in the direction of fostering new understandings and, let's say, concepts of artistic research that actually are viable?
I think when it comes to art education, since we are in this Academy of the Arts, I think that the university has to be more open to influence and not be so harsh. I think it is a mistake that we now we demand that students that are going to attend an art school, that they have to be able to read philosophical texts in English and have discussions like these in English, whereas you can make super interesting and really good art and not know very much about art history. You don't have to know it very much. You don't have to theorize anything. You can just do it. And I think it would be good if the art education would be more open to that. I think it would be good if the university would think it to be interesting to be ignorant.
There are some questions from the audience at this point. Patrick, can you give Hans a mic? Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Nina. I was studying visual art at the early 90s, end of the 80s, Konstfack and the Art Academy. My background is from Algeria, and that was important for my being as a person. And I think there is something that you are not telling in your story is that, well, also under the modernist hegemony, there was also rules and thing that you could not speak about. You could not speak about being from other countries in Europe and America. You could not speak about other way of thinking, existence of being a person. So at that moment, there was also rules that was hidden and not spoken about. And I was so happy when this postmodern philosophy come to our academy, because it opened up for thinking of other way of existence, other philosopher, other history, also breaking with the Western art, the hegemony of Western art history. So it was a liberation for me and many other young artists at that time. And I think this is important to remember that of course, a time have its own rulers and what you should speak and not speak about. And for me, it was for sure that the postmodern era opened up for new way of thinking, and you could see also in the art world, like Documenta in the early 95, I think, was almost only Western artists presented there. And well, with the postmodern turn in 2000, we saw all the world coming with so-called, yes.
Do you want me to comment on that? Yeah. Of course, you're right. When the modernists were like the elite of the art world, they were no more democratic than any other elite. The elite is never democratic, and they have all kinds of rules and regulations and hegemonic struggles going on. Of course it is like that. But I see today that I have to refer back to what I wrote in my text, is that we now see the whole spectrum of what is going on, from the material base, where you can immerse yourself into like a material, and then the whole spectrum over to the immaterial. We just recently had an immaterial monument produced and showed in Gothenburg in a park. And so we have the whole spectrum. So I think now we have an opportunity to challenge and explore this spectrum with all the cross-fertilization that goes on between them. If we acknowledge the right that you can be somewhere without the theorization, and you can be somewhere in the middle, and you can do a little bit of theorization, or you can do a lot of theorization. So I think we can take this step further and liberate ourselves a bit more if we keep this spectrum, the whole spectrum, alive and kicking. You know? So that was my comment. Was that a good comment, you think?
That was really refreshing, Nina, your way of producing your ideas so clearly as a manifest. I really like that. But you might even say, I was thinking when you were talking here that compared to the hegemonistic contemporary art scene, what you're doing is part of the expanded field, the critical expanded field. See what I mean?
No?
It's like, well, if you, well, working with hands-on, you know, the way
I'm
you're
sorry, I
doing.
didn't hear it. Working.
So I would say today, your ideas, they have, I mean, the scene is a lot more open, as you just said. Today, I mean, you have all the possibilities, and thanks to people like you, the critical aspect has changed or destabilized a little bit the hegemonistic ideas, I think.
I can recognize this openness, but it mostly it is talked about, and I don't see very much, you know, concrete results as to what students are allowed into the art schools and how the educational policies according to art, how everything is being treated. So there's always talk about how everything is possible and everything is free and everything is open, but I think we have to do better than that.
I was hoping anyway that, you know, the students produce art that is theoretically interesting and visually, materially interesting as well. So, strong.
Olga?
Theo, what you are inviting us to do without knowing, without having read Didier Ullmann, is it's to think ourselves, to use our common sense, to just drop the distinction between analog and digital. To just drop the distinction theory and practice. Because theory, in the daily use of theory, comes after the practice. Actually, the practitioners have written a lot of what we call theory today. So my point is that if you could free yourself from the hegemonic thoughts in your head and talk from there, because I agree with my colleague Hans Hamid Rasmussen that actually it's much more open. I think the students today are much freer. They have lots of possibilities that we also heard Victoria Brown and Max were talking about yesterday. So they have much different channels to express themselves and not slaves of that dichotomy of the modernity. So take the challenge now. How would you rewrite? Because the printmaking history, think of that printmaking also printed letters, right? So we can think anew, because I think it's what very challenging papers you gave that introduced us to that manifold ways of expressing yourself today.
Okay, yes?
Yeah, that was more of a comment, right?
Yeah. I think so, an appeal. I was just thinking that if we look at printmaking as a conceptualizing agent within the wider artistic practice, as seems to be Didier Huberman's aim, and that I see actually being a topic that runs through this conference, that printmaking is a kind of a story within the story rather than being, let's say, supplementing and multiplying and making available the main story. It suddenly turns up in the core of artistic, let's say, the possibility of conceptualizing practice rather than using a theoretical starting point to deliver concepts to artistic practice.
What is a conceptualizing agent?
Well, I think what Didier Huberman here proposes, rather than seeing printmaking as supplementing modern art history, is asking the experimental question, what happens when we put it in the middle? What is the yield, the stacking and the overflow from this, this knowledge onto other areas of artistic practice. So that it might be, let's say, a kind of theoretical practice somehow, but not of the kind that is articulated through discourse. I mean, discourse were, let's say, more harvests from this kind of experimentation rather than posing its basic premises. Of course, this is not the only way. I mean, there are thousands of ways one can imagine inventing a new invention of printing in a way, inventing it within artistic practice as a movement to understand this expanding field, not only from print, but the agency of printing as a way of let's say, understanding art, the broader art field in a different way. You see what I mean? I mean,
I think from printmaking, you can understand a great deal more than art. I mean, it has a huge impact on all of our societal life, political life. The history of what we know has been sort of influenced by printmaking in one way or another. Ever since Wang Ji wrote the first, or said that this book was reverently printed for his mother and father to be distributed for universal distribution. And I think printmaking has, of course, something of the universal distribution of it. That is a societal thing.
I think that printmaking, it's deeply connected with, yesterday we spoke about dissemination of knowledge. So it's in the core of this printmaking is always, it's not connected with art history in the same sense as painting. It's a different way. And that gives this idea of concept about matrix transmission, finding new ways to disseminate knowledge.
Yeah.
And it comes also to the digital.
Is it that you can say that printmaking is in fact dissemination in itself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's why I also kind of focused a little bit on the practice of printmaking as the driver of the expanding field. That practicing printmaking will provide a kind of expansion which is, let's say, conceptual in its workings. And thereby a kind of, I mean, if displacement is something which is key to the hatching of a conceptual understanding, then it could be articulated within the practice itself. It doesn't necessarily have to I mean, it is a kind of intelligence generating moment, I think, what you are talking about.
Yeah. And if we think about this encoding and black and white things, so if we think about this, Nina mentioned 60s and the conceptual turn, or underground papers, then punk, the little publishing, the environment movement, the feministic movement, all these little, what they published, black and white, it's connected also with these political things.
Okay. I think this is a precious moment in this conference to raise these issues, because if you look at curators like Nicolas Bourriaud, for instance, I feel that he, as a curator, has had the idea of resorting to moments of the Fluxus history and voice creative practice in order to use it as a lens for what's going on in the art world today. That is digging up something from the 70s, 80s and applying it to the artistic moments he thinks is important in his curatorial work within the art stage of the after the second millennium. So I'm just wondering, that is let's say maybe a curatorial strategy And then I'm thinking maybe an artistic strategy that might be one among several strategies could be the focus on print as a kind of has a power to penetrate and to illuminate a wider range of artistic practices. But then it would be the artist's initiative. It wouldn't be a curatorial initiative.
I don't know if I can
Yeah, sure.
answer that. I don't know if I understand you right, but I think you can go anywhere in art. When I work in my studio, time in art is like a room, and I can move anywhere I want in that room. I can move even away from the 70s and the 80s. I can move back to the cave paintings if I want, or have a collaboration with Bertus Pictor, who made the paintings in churches. And so, yes, that is an interesting strategy. But it is also a strategy that I have that is completely different. What I do in my studio is completely different intellectual activity than what I do when I try to analyze what it is I do when I do what I do in my studio. You know, there are two different, for me, and I realize, of course, that it is not like that for everyone. But again, to take this back to the educational, since there are a lot of students here, I think that all over the Western world, all the art schools have one aim, and that is the personal progress and the development and your own, to find your own way of expressing yourself in your art. And all of that is a very individual process. But when it comes to the theorization, everybody is supposed to know about the same philosophers and the same names and the same texts and the same writings, and you're supposed to make your examinations and your tests and your points and your university credits. Then all of a sudden everything is supposed to be the same, and I cannot understand why is that. Why is it that I cannot just go and make something with a Upanishad, and I don't know what that is in English.
Upanishad, I guess.
Yeah, that the theory part seems to me so restricted.
So, but it depends what we mention as a theory. Of course, we can speak a theory that you analyze a little bit your practice, you see what's happening, and make conclusions. Perhaps it opens you new doors, go forward with the material process or something like that. I think that would be the best way to use theory. Of course, if we have names and name dropping and notes and all kind of this, it's very difficult to unite this theory to your artistic practice.
Yeah, this is it.
So it must, of course, then we have this artistic research. So what comes from your practice.
I think maybe parts of this are discussions we could pursue during lunch, and maybe also comparing our curricula of how we are working with these issues, because I think we're working with them everywhere, certainly. I mean, the examples of someone doing dyeing of wool for 5 years and weaving fabrics, and then Merleau-Ponty comes flying like an eagle, dropping golden eggs over this landscape, that crash because the training is not there in terms of reading Merleau-Ponty and just being successful in it. So then it produces bad theory, basically. Yes. Why not having the attitude that artistic practice can open doors that we didn't know existed into certain texts that don't have to be known, that are kind of prized because they are unique and connected to practice. So I mean, there are so many ways of pursuing these issues and taking them onwards within the institutions. But I'm just wondering, and we may want to pursue that discussions in the afternoon, about how we can, in a way, communicate not only within educational institutions about these issues, but let society around us also have a clearer image of what we're doing these days.
Yeah.
So,
I think I wanted to point out also that we are talking actually now of artist practices and education, and it's all like in the world of artists, and we didn't spoke about the audience, the one who sees it.
Absolutely.
And that's really an important thing for me, because when I was working for, still working for the Frans Masereel-Centre, at one point we had like budget cuts and everything, political stuff is raising up, and we have to think about like, okay, what is the relevance for society, our center? Because we get money from the society, so we have to think also about that part, like how you can be in society that people cares for you. And this is something which I would start thinking about, and then I came also to the history of printmaking, and then I was like, yeah, but it's so clear that actually what printmaking does is it's really society based, so there is actually also a value into it. And this is something what I sometimes, if I look to graphic arts or printmaking, sometimes I miss like a little bit more connection to the society, like, and yeah, that's.
Would you like a concluding?
Yes, I would like to comment on that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, because what I find today is that artists get more and more of a pedagogical, or are expected to have a pedagogical ambition, that because we have to compensate, because the schools have abandoned this. They don't teach art as a language possibility.
I don't know what you're talking about. I completely disagree. Sorry, I just had to say, I put my hand up. Okay. And I strongly disagree with this idea that students aren't getting informed, that they shouldn't be learning about theory. It actually really makes me quite angry, because that's why we're here. We are here to give context. We're here to give context. We are here to encourage the students to teach themselves, to inspire them through the ability of a fantastic library for them to go and read. And it's hard to engage this generation in getting them to read about theory and to get them to read about context. And the idea that you should be encouraging them to remain ignorant because that's going to develop their practice, I have to say I'm on a very different level to that. I'm also on a very different level to the idea of being an entrepreneur, being fearful of being an entrepreneur. If you don't like an audience, if you don't want to sell to your audience, you will rely on charity, you will rely on funding, you will rely on the state to support you. And that is not where I see my students. That's not what I want to encourage them to rely on. And the question I really wanted to ask you actually was, Sophie started to answer that, which was, I know that the Frans Masereel is actually expanding, and you've got a government that does support the department in that you run. So from a political standpoint, why does a government believe that printmaking is worth investing in?
Yeah, but this is the question which is now on the table for us. So it was the past, like in 1972, we had like a Minister of Culture, which was like, he had like great ideas about what art had to be, and it's not only in Belgium, it was general, like in the 70s, art had to be close to the people, and it has to be democratic, and everybody had to be possible to have assessment, no, not assessment, or close to art. So he made like some art centers. In every city in Belgium we got an art center, and everything was for free. And also he bought the Frans Masereel-Centre, because it was a private initiative in the 60s. He bought it, and everything was also for, I think, 40 years for free, that everybody could work there, and the main idea of the Frans Masereel-Centre was not only graphic printmaking, but it was also for video or photography. They wanted to build a really big artist village. But after that minister, let's say, the Frans Masereel-Centre was for the Minister of Culture, but they just kept on, giving funding until, like, I think 6-7 years ago, they said, "Whoa, what are we doing actually? Why do we give indeed the money to the printmaking?" So there was no really a reason why they gave money. yeah, it's a little bit strange. But in a way, then they started to think about like, okay, printmaking, and they start questioning, and the center had to change also for the way to deal with print. It had to be much more open climate and invite people and do much more activities for public and everything, because they ask like, okay, you have to have like a relevance, society relevance with your center. And in the last, I think, 6-7 years, we succeeded to say to the government, like, okay, printmaking, it's really, really interesting. It's one of the most interesting media nowadays to support. So don't close the center and go for it. And they did. So yeah, yeah. So. I try to convince the political situation, the Flemish one, to give money, to still give money to the center because of the printmaking itself, which is really, if you see to the economical aspect of making prints, it's quite, you can really make with less money good prints, and it's something for the artistic practice for young artists really interesting to use. And also what we are discussing now, the concepts, like the thinking of making things, it's such a long process to make prints that, yeah, it's very interesting to reflect on art practices and everything. So yeah, in a way they got the message a little bit, and yeah. But still, it's a difficult situation in Belgium at this moment. But yeah, till now we're a little bit safe.
So, can I comment on Victoria's?
I think we have to start rounding up.
But
okay, I want to continue.
I think I have to comment before. Because, of course, I don't want students to be ignorant. That's just silly. Why should
That's what you stated, so it's important for the students to understand the context of what you're saying.
I mean, you cannot...
You've got to be direct.
I cannot neglect the situation that we're in with this, the way it looks, with the theory parts and everything. I cannot neglect the way the society looks. And I too have to discuss with students and how they should come about. But what I mean is that you can actually... You don't have to agree. You can oppose this. You don't have to agree. You don't have to state that this is the way it is, and then we have to accept it, and then we have to go on from there. I oppose this situation. I do not like that the Swedish government, in what's that called when you implement entrepreneurship from preschool to university level, and says that this is to pervade all stages, and then at the same time they take away art. I don't accept that, and I don't think that is being ignorant or encouraging ignorance. I too have to be an entrepreneur as the best that I can. Of course, it is not my choice. I'm not more in need of charity than a nurse or a teacher in a school or anybody else that is getting paid from the government or tax money or whatever, you know, the public money that we have in society. I contribute as an artist. I do my best to contribute to a society that wants to be a society for the people. But I still think that we don't have to be so restricted when it comes to the theory part in the art education.
Okay,
just say one thing about Marcel Duchamp. There's a really interesting interview. If you haven't seen it, on YouTube, his last interview, BBC interview, where he actually comes out as an iconoclast.
Okay, good. On those words, I think that what we're dealing with here is not only to locate printmaking within wider artistic mediations and practices, but it's also about locating theory in the artistic practice, in the exhibit situation and towards the public, and in artistic research. These views are not homogeneous, but converge to a need to bring some kind of redrawing of the map or rehistoricizing the field in which I think these positions should be kept distinct. I mean, there's not one voice coming from this panel, and I hope that we get 3 more voices this afternoon that will say other things, but might converge on some of the burning issues, so we can get further on those during the conference. So thank you for your participation and for your willingness to have this three-way conversation, and enjoy your lunch. See you later.
Thank you.